Good evening, everyone. Tonight's shiur is called Secrets to the Exodus, Part 2. Just to recap very briefly, we asked how is it possible that the Jewish nation sunk 49 levels, descended 49 levels of impurity, and were able to ascend from that, or able to extricate themselves and secure themselves redemption. We said that must be that one last gate that wasn't yet contaminated was so powerful that was able to take the Jewish people out of that impurity and secure them redemption. And what was that one gate? That one gate, that last gate, was the power of faith. And why is the power of faith so powerful? Because it is a quintessential part of who we are. It is a very core and essence of who we are that represents transcendence, that represents that which is beyond any contamination or is able to supersede and fill in the gaps of any contamination. And working in that line, we mentioned that how is it possible that the sages sat around the Seder night and Vayu Mesaprim B'Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim Kol Oto Halayla, and that whole night they were speaking about the Exodus. The Exodus story is not that long, is not that intricate, and surely they were aged scholars. How much could they already add to everything that they were speaking about the years before? And we mentioned, because here we're not just talking about the story of Exodus. What we are doing is revealing within ourselves a concept of faith and trust in God, and that is the quintessential part of us that is bli gvul, that is unlimited, has no limitations. And that is the reason why they were able to speak and expound about this concept the whole night. And that's what it says. He who extends this concept of the Haggadah and the telling over of the Exodus, is very praiseworthy, etc. So this is the line that we went in last week. Now we have to add upon that in many aspects. The Kabbalists teach us that the exile of Egypt had many functions. It came to rectify many things. One of the things that it came to rectify was the sale of Yosef, the fact that in one aspect Abraham Avinu showed for his level a certain lack of faith, and that is why God revealed to Abraham Avinu that your children will be strangers in a strange land, in the land of Egypt. So that came to rectify that. But in addition to all of this, the Kabbalists teach us that the exile of Egypt came to rectify 3 generational sins. And what were these 3 generational sins that were not just sins, were flaws that contaminated the very ground, so to speak, contaminated the very air? The Gemara in Masechet Hagigah in page 16 says a very interesting thing. The bricks of one's wall, me'aidim alav, the very stones of one's wall, or the very korot gago, the beams of one's roof, comes and gives testimony. It's a very interesting thing that Gemara says, that gives testimony upon the actions of man. Well, we need the bricks of the house. We need the beams of the walls of the ceilings to give testimony before God. The Gemara there says, well, what happens if a person does a sin in private? So the Gemara asks, who gives testimony to it? In other words, the person himself thinks that nobody gives testimony. But the fact that he sins privately and doesn't sin, God forbid, publicly, shows that he's more concerned about what people think than what God thinks, so to speak. But the Gemara says a very interesting thing. Because he sins privately, so to speak, he thinks to himself, who gives testimony, so to speak, to my sin? Whereas if I sin publicly, people see and people are corrupted by it. And the Gemara tries to analyze, is it worse to sin privately or publicly? And the Gemara there goes in the whole extension there. It's not the topic for tonight. But what is interesting is one of the commentaries makes a very beautiful note there, and he writes that why does it say the walls or the bricks or the very tiles or the very stones of one's house? Gives testimony because we affect our environment. We affect our environment, which means to say that where we do something good, we impact the very walls, the very ground that we walk on. When we do something, God forbid, which is impure, we also affect the environment around us. There was an interesting story told about a particular rabbi came to pray in a particular synagogue, and he prayed in the corner, and he later on came to the rabbi of that synagogue and said that I've never felt such holiness before, and I've never prayed with such intensity before. Tell me, do you have any idea why this could be? Is there something special about the synagogue, the city, this place perhaps? And he said, tell me, by any chance, did you pray in that corner over there? And he said, yes, I did. And he said, well, a couple of decades ago, the Holy Gaon of Vilna prayed in that very place. And obviously, whenever someone prays there, feels that sanctity still there. As it says, the Gemara tells us, Kedusha lo zaza mimkoma, holiness never leaves its place, which means to say that our very actions, korot shel adam, as the Gemara says, korot shel adam eidim alav, the very beams give testimony to him, which means to say, why is it that they give testimony? Because they are suffused, they absorb the holiness or the lack of holiness, so to speak. And so too it is with the generation. When a whole generation, the generation of the flood, for example, sinned, they contaminated the very earth. They contaminated the trees. They contaminated the whole world. They contaminated the very animals. And that needed to be rectified, although that God brought a flood to the world and, so to speak, cleanse the world and purify the world. But that concept of the sin of the flood, that generational sin of the flood, still exists to a certain degree. And what is that? That is a total disregard for other people. We know that one of the sins of the generation of the flood was the total disregard in respect for other people. Immorality was rampant, where a person had no respect, not only for one's belonging, but one's wife, one's husband, etc. And the Kabbalists tell us that there were 3 generational sins that the exile of Egypt came to rectify. And they were the sin, or to rectify the negative effect on the world of the flood, the generation of the flood, the generation of Haplaga, which was the Tower of Babel that caused disunity in the world, and the generation of Enosh, which introduced the concept of dual beliefs, or a lack of true appreciation of God's oneness and unity in the world. And I will explain each one. In the generation of Aflaga, their ego got the better of them. The generation of the Tower of Babel, their ego got the better of them. They wanted to make a name for themselves. Their self-importance was, they were so acutely aware of themselves that they totally disregarded the awesomeness and the effect of God in the world. So this is one of these sins that had to be rectified, which still exists. And that is ego. Ego is the essence and the core of all impurities. And the generation of Enosh, we know that Maimonides explains to us how was it possible to deny God and to worship sticks and stones, graven images, the sun, moon, wind, water, etc. So the Maimonides takes us through the process, and he explains very interesting how it happened. It began in the generation of Enosh, where in the generation of Enosh, they believed in God, but they believed that God is so remote and so abstract that has no connection to this physical, mundane world. And we know that God created the world and has a purpose for creating the world and is intimately involved in the world and has divine providence upon the world. They didn't believe in divine providence. They believed in God, and therefore they concluded that since God is so awesome and unlimited, and since God himself bestowed powers on the celestial beings, on the heavens, on the the stars, the constellations, the sun, the moon, and the constellations, they began to use them as mediums. If God paid respect to them, if God suspended them in the heavens and made them so great and so awesome and so powerful by the mere fact that they influence the whole world, the sun influences growth and everything, the moon influences as well growth and tides and winds, etc. So surely the Almighty has bestowed such importance to them, then surely we too must give them and accord them some sort of divine respect and power. And they began to use them as mediums, not as a deity for themselves, but as a medium to approach God, so to speak. And thus began the concept of the descent from the worship of one God to pluralistic belief in different gods. The next generation began to make images of the sun, of the moon, etc., as a symbol to the divine powers that God bestowed upon the heavens and the celestial beings and the horoscopes and all of that stuff. The 12 mazalot. How do you say in English mazalot again? The which? Yeah, how do you call it? The 12, what do they call it? Signs. The zodiac signs. The zodiac signs or stars or whatever. They do. They have influence. They have influence in the world. They surely do. And then subsequent generations began to worship the images themselves. Before that, the moon, the thing themselves, independent from God. And subsequent generations, they made images of the sun and the moon, etc. And subsequent generations began to attribute power to the very images themselves. And thus began the concept of the opposite of monotheism and the belief in plural gods. Came the generation of the exile and came to rectify these three dimensions. And how so? We find that kol haben hayeora tashlichuhu, that Paro commanded all of the sons born, all of the males born in Egypt, throw them in the river. We know that at that time Egypt was a very decadent society, very immoral society. Their sexual appetites weren't controlled and weren't disciplined. And we know that, of course, the children is a byproduct of intimacy and purity, or the lack of purity, of fidelity, etc. And therefore, and the concept of the flood or the waters, the water itself was a symbol of that they didn't have respect for boundaries. And thus, that, so to speak, came to atone or rectify that still remnants of the effect of the generation of the flood. As well as the concept of the generation of the Tower of Babel, of ego, of self-worship. The Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people, took away their freedom, suppressed them, broke their spirits, broke their very being, took away their very entity. There was nothing to have an ego anymore. They were slaves. They had no self-identity anymore. They were stripped from their ego. They didn't have any identity whatsoever. That came to rectify for that particular sin. And then there was the generation, the concept of idol worship, where we know that Egypt as well didn't believe in monotheism, and even those that recognized the power of God as working within the realm of nature certainly did not believe in divine providence, that God governs and influences every aspect of world history and existence, as we discussed last week in the symbol of Hametz and Matzah. So that came to rectify that sin. And how so? By the Jewish people being commanded by God to mishchu ukchu, draw yourself away from the culture and the belief system of Egypt, and take a ram, which was the Aries, which was one of the zodiac signs that the Egyptians attributed divine power to, and they were expected to slaughter it before the eyes of Egypt and to present it as a paschal lamb for all generations, but particularly in Egypt itself, which was a very great act and symbolized the fact that the Jewish people broke away from the culture and the belief system and the philosophy of Egypt and had embedded themselves or revealed within themselves the belief and the faith in the one God that runs the world. And to do so, you have to be able to have a great level of belief and faith in Hashem to be able to do that act. We know that people are even afraid today to say things that are true, but are not politically correct. The influence of society is so great that we are intimidated to say the truth if it's not politically correct, or if we perceive to be called a particular name or be categorized by people in some way. So the influence of the society around us has great swing and pull upon us. For the Jewish people who were still slaves and not yet been redeemed, technically they're still slaves, even though they weren't enslaved during the 10 plagues, but they were still slaves in Egypt. To do that is a great act of sacrifice, of determination, of inner strength, willpower, and the belief in God. That is that 50th gate that we were talking about, that was able to secure them the merit to be able to extricate themselves from the 49 levels of impurity and to torpedo them to the 49 levels of holiness, of which ultimately they received the Torah. Similarly, a great act of faith that the Jewish people showed was when it says, "Vayishlach parot ha'am v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz pelishtim ki karov hu." When the Jewish people finally secured their exodus and were redeemed from Egypt, they traveled towards the sea, the Red Sea. And it says that God directed them away from the land of Pelishtim, even though the land of Pelishtim was a closed route. The fact that the Jewish people went into the desert and moved away from a route that is more inhabited is a great act of kindness, to the extent that the Prophet says in the name of God, "Lech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerua. V'zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich." I will always remember the kindness that you did in your youth, meaning to say at the birth of our nation, where you went after me in the desert, be'eretz lo zerua, in a land not inhabited, not sown, where there was no supplies. And what did the Jewish people do? They accepted and they left and they went. Now to go and travel through the land of Pelishtim is a sure bet. Why? Because even if the Philistines were to come and wage war against the Jewish people, there's a few possibilities. Maybe they will be victorious. There's a chance that they will be victorious. Especially after nations heard the great miracles that happened in Egypt, maybe they will be fearful of the Jewish nation. Maybe they will allow the Jewish people to traverse through their land. So that's a possibility. Possibility 2 is maybe even if they will go against them in war, they will be victorious. Possibility 3, even if they are not going to be victorious, is an opportunity to flee. Possibility 4, even if they don't flee, maybe they'll be taken captives and be able to live. Whereas to travel through the desert, there's only one possibility. And the possibility is to die, because you have no provisions. There's no water, there's no provisions, there's nothing growing in the desert. There's only one possible outcome, one possible scenario, and that is die. Unless your faith in God is so great that you went and followed God without any hesitation, which they did. And for that, God calls out a great kindness in their youth, in their birth of a nation. So again, we see the act of faith of believing in God during the difficult times of exile, that they maintained onto that faith. They never lost that faith. That was at 49th, 50th level that they never lost. They showed that faith when Moshe Rabbeinu first came and spoke in the name of God, and even though that later on they had difficulties, and because Paro increased the labor, etc., and then they went to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, "What have you done to us?" But nonetheless, when Moshe Rabbeinu did come, despite the fact that they were enslaved and they were slaves, they did show faith in God. And thirdly, when they were commanded to take the Paschal lamb. And the symbol of that was the matzah that they ate in Egypt. This is what we asked the question last week. Why do we say this is the bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt? The Exodus is to commemorate the bread that the ancestors ate when they left Egypt, because it shows that they were in a rush, in a flurry to leave Egypt and to follow God absolutely and faithfully. And they had no provisions. And they took with them the dough, and the dough didn't rise. Yet we commemorate the bread that they ate in Egypt as well, because that is a symbol of faith that they had in Egypt as well. Because without the faith that they had in Egypt itself, there wouldn't have been an Exodus in the first place. And then the very act of going out of Egypt, where they followed God and didn't follow the path of Plishtim, of the land of Plishtim, which was inhabited land, where the supplies and there's a chance of survival. That was an extension of their belief again and their faith in God continually. And as we mentioned before, this ingredient of belief is the very core and identity of who we are. There's a problem though with belief. And the problem with belief is it transcends logic. It transcends intellect. Because by the very nature it comes from the soul, it doesn't come from intellect. Knowledge that God created the world, that intellect understands that there is a creator. But the belief in the creator and everything that he does and everything that he says, that is a level of sight or seeing that only the soul perceives. Now, if your body and your mind and your heart is not yet ready for that, then unfortunately what ends up happening is that belief tends to be transcendental and is beyond you and doesn't penetrate your heart and your actions. You ask someone who did something wrong, do you believe in God? Of course I believe in God. So why did you do it? Don't have an answer. The reason is because your belief system has not yet penetrated your heart, your mind. And for this reason, there were 3 groups of plagues in Egypt. Datah, Datah, Hadash, Be'ahav. The 3 groups. The 3 groups pertain to 3 dimensions. The water, the land, and the sky, the air. Which means that God's dominion is of every aspect of creation. But it also is an expression of God's reward for the fact that the Jewish people were able to engrave their faith in 3 dimensions for their 3 levels of faith. There is the faith of intellect, there is the faith of the soul. Of course, that's where it comes from. But the objective is to be able to take this faith and to express it in our mind, in our hearts, and in our actions. This is what David HaMelech says, Kal atzmotai tomarna Hashem michamocha. All of my bones will proclaim, O God, who is like you? What does it mean, all of my bones? So there are those that explain that when you pray, you have to pray with all of you. You have to move and flicker. And your whole body must proclaim the glory of God. Kal atzmotai tomarna Hashem michamocha. All of my bones proclaim, who is like you, O God? Means to say that our faith and our belief in God has penetrated our body as well. Our consciousness, not just our subconsciousness. Our mind, our thinking process, our feelings, our emotions, and our actions, the world of actions. This is why the Kabbalists teach us that the level of da'at, of knowledge, was exiled. In other words, the intellectual faculties of our ancestors in Egypt was exiled. What does that mean? It means they believed in God, but it didn't penetrate their thinking process. They didn't act upon it. And predominantly, the third and most powerful power of the intellect is what's called da'at, knowledge, when you become one with something. And as I mentioned last week, da'at is a connecting power. V'adam yadda et Hava, and man knew Hava, means to say he became one with her. That is the expression used for intimacy, as we discussed last week, because you become one. That's da'at. Da'at is a connecting power. It means when you know when you understand something, and then your emotions connect with it, becomes part of you. I know it. I know it means it's me. It's now ingrained with me. Not just that I've understood something, but I know it means to say it's one with me. It's a part of me, part of my psyche now, part of my way of life. In Egypt, this faculty was in exile, meaning to say that they were not able to penetrate their faith into their daily lives. But as Moshe Rabbeinu came, and as they developed slowly, they finally, the Exodus was to redeem that level of conscious belief in God. And that's what we mentioned last week, that a child is not able to recognize his father and call his father until he tastes the flavor of bread. And in our case, there are many reasons why, but in our case, before we can get to have normal bread, we have to first eat matzah, and we have to be very clear, which is also bread. But the bread of faith, that we call bread of faith, is specifically matzah, that shows God's governance over the world. As we said, the difference between hametz, dough that rises, and dough of matzah is that one is continually kneaded, showing that God is continually directing the world. That shows a level of faith. And that's why matzah is a symbol of faith, or the bread. Ichla, the mehemnuta, the Kabbalists call it the bread of faith. And when you eat this bread of faith, both the bread itself and what it symbolizes, you make it a part of you. You begin to think and breathe and feel and act upon that faith, which faith itself is transcends our intellect and our emotions, and our objective is to be able to draw it down and reveal the faith that comes from the neshama into my body, into my intellect, to the extent of all of my bones, so to speak, all of my very being, my entity, my conscious self, as well as my subconscious, my conscious self also proclaims the glory of God and recognizes in a clear way, and is able to call like a child recognizes its father and calls Father. We are able to recognize our Father in heaven and call Father in a clear way, in a way that there's no ambiguity, there's no concealment, and there is no doubt. And that is the whole objective of exile and Exodus, to come out of that, to redeem ourselves from that lack of true perception of godliness. That's why the concept of Exodus is so important and so central to our faith, and that the Seder experience is so importantly powerful. It's not just something that we're just acknowledging God, saying thank you very much for redeeming us out of slaves. It is way beyond that. And that the limitations of Egypt still exist today as long as we are in exile. And that needs to be redeemed from exile till today. As the Gemara says in Masechet Megillah, Akati Avda da Hashverosh, we are still servants of Ahashverosh still, despite the fact that Haman was vanquished, despite the fact that Mordechai was brought up to the highest of levels, despite the fact that the danger that loomed over the Jewish people was removed, they were still subjects of Ahashverosh, and they still did not yet build the second Bet HaMikdash. That is applicable to us. We have not yet built the third Bet HaMikdash. So we have work to do. And that's why we must experience the Pesach experience in a literal way. The Exodus must be in a literal way. And for this reason, we mentioned in the very first of the 10 Commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And he does not say, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth. Why does it not say, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth? Well, for one reason that's given is because nobody witnessed creation of heaven and earth. We only witnessed the byproduct of creation and earth. We came afterwards. But every Jew witnessed, and every soul of every Jew, the source of the soul of every Jew, witnessed the Exodus. It's a part of our DNA, it's a part of our psyche. We were there, our souls were there. My body wasn't there, but my soul, the spark of my soul that is rooted in those souls that were there, feels it, knows it. That's one reason. Another reason is because God's relationship that he wants to have with us must transcend the intellect. Creation is something that is intellectually understood, that there is a creator, just like you understand that there's a creator of this table, creator of these walls. It doesn't happen on its own. It didn't happen randomly that a wind came and collected from a brick, what do they call it? A brick shop, I don't know what, a ceramic brick quarry, and somehow a wind came and landed them in a exact manner, and from another place came cement and landed exactly in between the bricks exactly, and everything turned out the way it is. The parochet and the name came out perfectly like that. Some machine somehow turned on and everything worked like that. We understand logic dictates that cannot be. So logic dictates that there must be a creator. We understand that. But that's serving God only within the limitations and the confines of logic, and that in itself is a limitation. Mitzrayim means limitation. Going out of Mitzrayim means going out of all limitations, even the limitations of understanding God. That is also a limitation. Of course we must understand God, but woe to us if we serve God only within the limitation of knowing and understanding God. That is a very limited form of serving God that only comes from the body. Whereas the greatest form of serving God comes from the soul, and that is reflected through faith. And that is why it says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Not the Lord your God who took you out of, who created heaven and earth. Because if it was to state, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth, our relationship with God and our understanding of God would be limited just to that. God expects more. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. What was the secret ingredient that took you out of Egypt? Your faith, your belief in God that transcends your intellect, but must penetrate intellect at the same time. But must be drawn down to intellect at the same time. As we said, all of my bones, all of my entity, all of my psyche, my consciousness, my revealed consciousness will proclaim and know with clarity that God is God. But the aspect of God, the clarity of God, not in the knowledge of God, but in the belief in God, which comes from the soul, which transcends everything about us. A much higher level of understanding or clarity of godliness. And for this reason, we are bidden every day to remember a few things. One of the things that we remember every day is the standing in Har Sinai and receiving the Torah. But twice a day, and even more, but minimally twice a day, because we recite the Shema in the morning and in the evening, more than we are bidden to remember the receiving of the Torah, we are bidden and commanded to remember the going out of Egypt. Even more than the receiving of the Torah. Because that was that secret ingredient that connects us to God and connects us to the Torah. The faith. That level, that prerequisite, that important ingredient. And for this reason, the plagues were split into three. Because that faith has two. Cannot remain in the realm of transcendence, of just soul, because the soul exists in the body and must work in sync and in harmony. And just as God showed mastery over three dimensions of existence of the world, and it's interesting to note that, remember we said before that the Kabbalists teach us that the exile came to rectify three generational sins. Again, the number three. It comes to implant within us faith, both in our mind, in our heart, and in our very being. And that is the group of 3 groups and categories of plagues. They were divided into 3 for this reason. Let us just end off with a very interesting Gemara. Masechet Ta'anit ends with a very, very beautiful piece. And I will end with that. The Gemara says, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'asot mahol tzadikim. In the end of days, the time of the ultimate redemption, the Almighty will, so to speak, make a circle for the tzaddikim, for the righteous. And God will reveal Himself within that circle, so to speak. And each one, so to speak, will point with his finger and say, Zeh Elokenu, kivinu lo. This is the God that we hoped for, that we believed in, that we had faith in all of the times of our exile. This is the God, so to speak. What does that mean, this is the God? Can you point to God? Even when God will be revealed, can you point to God? We know that when the Torah was given, it says they saw the voice of God emanating from Mount Sinai. What does it mean that they saw the voice? It means that their perception of the Torah and their understanding and the perception of God was such that it was no longer in the level of hearing, it was in the level of seeing. And we discussed last week the difference between the two. When you hear something, your level of understanding is nowhere as deep and as solid as when you see something. When you see something, you understand it in a second, and you become one with that, and you identify every aspect of it immediately. There's clarity with you in that thing that you're looking at. Whereas when you hear about something, you have to understand it and develop it in your mind and churn it in your mind and come to grasp and grapple with the idea in your mind. It's nowhere near as the same perception. So too, when you hear words of Torah, or when the words of Torah become one with you, is a big difference. Hear words of Torah, it has to go through your mind, you have to analyze it, think about it, this and that. This is the reason why I pause sometimes. People ask me, why do you pause when you speak? Because I allow people a little bit of time. When I study Gemara, whatever it is I study, I stop for a minute just to think about what I just said. And even though I understand it, but I pause a bit more, and sometimes I go over it again just to give myself an opportunity to be able to grapple with it and understand it and ensure that I understand it as best as possible. But when you become one with an idea and a thought, it's so one with you, that level of perception, the clarity is much greater. That's called sight, when you see it. When Mashiach comes in the ultimate redemption, godliness will be so revealed even to the righteous that it cannot be compared then, the perception of godliness, as it was before, even to the righteous. To the extent that it's almost like, symbolically, they will point and say, this is God. It'll be so clear. This is the God that we hoped for. In other words, the God that we perceive through our faith, but was not yet as clear in our mind and in our heart and in our actions as it is through the way, the clarity, the way the soul sees, their bodies will see in the time of the redemption. Which means it'll be clear. But what's interesting to note is it says, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Lasot Mahol HaTzadikim. God will make like a circle and He will be, so to speak, in the middle. That's very significant language. And I'll tell you why I think so. I mean, everything in Gemara and everything, the sages, is very particular. But I'll tell you the message that I learned from that. The Holy Arizal teaches us in the very beginning of Otzrot Hayim that there are 2 types of emanations of light. Or Yashar or Orakav and Igulim. There are lights that come in a direct sort of measured path, and there are lights that come in a spherical manner. And this is not the forum to be able to explain and expand upon that. But similar to this, the Kabbalists teach us that there are two types of divine revelations, one that's called Memale Kol Almin and one that's called Sovev Kol Almin. Memale Kol Almin, the Gemara in Masechet Brachot tells us that Kashem shehaneshama memala et haguf, kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu memala et ha'olam. Man is like is a microcosm. Just as just as the soul fills the body and enlivens the body, so to God, so to speak, fills the earth with his energy and enlivens the world. That the Kabbalists call memale kol almin. That's a light or energy or life source that encloses itself in the body or the world. And as I mentioned many times, the Kabbalist calls it vessels. So vessels is another word for body or world or whatever it is. Like a cup. A cup contains water. A 200 ml cup contains how many mils? 200 mils. A very fine glass will contain the type of liquid that it contains. You cannot put melted lead into a glass cup, can you? Into a glass goblet, can you? It'll melt because the vessel is not made for that. You need to put it in another container, some sort of steel container that it can handle that heat, or maybe stone, or whatever it is. The vessel is always in accordance with the light, and the light always is in accordance with the vessel. Which means to say that the light that is called Memale Kol Almin, the light that God infuses the world with his energy, is a limited light that is in accordance with the vessel, with the limitation of the vessel. Were the light to be beyond that vessel, then there will be shattering of the vessel, so to speak. The vessel will not be able to remain a vessel. It will turn into light. Meaning to say, a light bulb of 200 watts can only take 200 watts. If you suddenly plug it into 1 billion watts, it won't be a light bulb, it'll just burst. It's too much light for it. So too, there's a particular energy in an ant, a particular energy in a leaf, particular energy in a giraffe, a particular energy in the sun, a particular energy in a human being. In accordance with what that vessel, that body can take. Not too much revelation, a very beautiful balance. Not too much revelation, for if there's too much revelation, we will no longer have free choice, or we will no longer be a vessel anymore. Vessel means to say that we are some sort of entity. If the godly light is so revealed, so powerful, my entity will cease to exist. So that is called the light Memale Kol Almin. Then there's a light that is the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, that is not limited. That's called Sovev Kol Almin. That is the light that encompasses all worlds. The reason why it's called Sovev Kol Almin, for a few reasons. Sovev Kol Almin encompasses the world, means to say that encompassing means that it is detached from the world. It is such a sublime light that the vessel cannot contain it, cannot reveal it. It exists in the world, it exists in the vessel, but the vessel cannot relate to it. It's not revealed in the vessel. For if it was revealed in the vessel will cease to be a vessel. So that light exists in the world, but it's hidden. That's the infinite light of God. That's called Sovev Kol Almin, the light that encompasses the world. The reason why it's called Sovev Kol Almin, encompasses, because it's detached from the world, it's not enclosed within the world. That's one reason. And also a spherical, a sphere or a circle is a symbol of, what do you think is a symbol of? Infinity. It continues, has no beginning, no end. The Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, has no beginning, no end. It's continuous. So that's why it's called Sovev Kol Almin, the light that encompasses the world like a circle. These are the two lights. The infinite light, our objective is to so refine the vessel that vessel will be able to then be refined enough to reveal that light too. And when that light is able to be revealed, that will herald in the exodus of the redemption, again, transcendence of the vessel, that the vessel will be able to take that light. Therefore, borrowing this concept, I applied it to what we just said now. Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'asot mahol tzadikim, the Almighty will make a circle for the tzadikim. What then do you think that means? The circle. It means today God will reveal His full glory of the infinite light that transcends world, transcends vessels, will be contained within the vessel itself. And that is the greatest form of unity and harmony between the light and vessel, or the concept of clarity of understanding God within intellect, emotion, and body, which to a certain degree needed to be achieved in Egypt for the Exodus to happen, and was achieved on a greater level in the giving of the Torah. But to our misfortune, through the sin of the golden calf, that level was diminished, and we're still working on it. When we complete that concept, where, so to speak, God will make a circle, means to say, will reveal the infinite light, the light that is symbolically referred to as a circle, or Sovev Kol Almin, and each one will point with clarity and say, this is the God that we hope for. In other words, when we believed in God, we believed in that level. It was that's that level that we knew from a soul level, but not so much from a perceptive level, from an intellectual level. When Mashiach will come, they will point and say, Zeh Elokeinu kibinu lo. This is a God that we believed in the level of belief, but now it's become one that we can point to with our mind, with our heart, and with our actual body and finger and feel it. The clarity is so great of this infinite light, which we do not see right now. Do you see it? I don't see it. But I know that every single time we do mitzvah, every single time we study Torah, every single time we refine or repel our impulses, we actually draw down this light in this world. When the vessels are refined enough, they will be revealed to the extent that we will see it and point, so to speak, figuratively be able to point to it. This happened, as I said, in redemption to a certain degree. It happened in the giving of the Torah to a highest degree. And it will happen in the most highest degree when Mashiach will come speedily in our day. Amen. So now we understand a little bit of the Seder, of what redemption is all about, of what Matzah is all about, what is expected of us, and what we are able to achieve in the Seder is a very holy night. Use it properly, and don't just skip through the Haggadah and skip through the concept, because what can be achieved on that night. And the eating of the Matzah, don't look at it as a burden, but it's what you're able to achieve through eating the Matzah is unbelievably phenomenal. Have a happy and kosher Pesach. May we all merit the ultimate Exodus, to the extent we'll be able to have unbelievable clarity of godliness in the world. Amen.